So welcome everyone to this session of Weber Scholars Network. I'm Victor Strazzeri, one of the coordinators of the network. And today we have another entry in our series about Weber as a political thinker, the late Weber as a political thinker. And it's my pleasure to introduce the session, which is centered on a very unique entry into the Weber literature, in the vast Weber literature, which is the book Max Weber and Culture of Anarchy, edited by Sam Whimster. The book came out 25 years ago, and I find it pretty singular, not only because of the collection of experts it brought together, and by the fact that it still remains compelling reading, but because I think it touches on topics and themes regarding Weber that have never really been explored in depth, or at least except for perhaps singular entries into the Weber scholarship, and which I'd say many of the questions the book raised about Weber, about how we relate to Weber and his legacy, remain in a way open and haven't been followed up on by the scholarship. I guess that's something we'll be discussing with Sam. The way the meeting will be structured today is we have three entries, or three small contributions, oral contributions by members of the network. We'll start with Lucía Pinto, who's a postdoc in sociology at the University of Buenos Aires. We will then go to Yannis Ktenas, who is a postdoc in sociology at the National Capodistria University of Athens. And then I'll be following up and making a short contribution myself. I'm a postdoc in sociology at the Federal University of São Paulo. And the idea is that we each took a chapter or a section of this book, which is very rich and we won't be able to cover it full, to summarize it and do some questions on. And then we'll open the floor to Sam, the editor himself, who'll be contextualizing the book, talking a little bit about how it came to be and how what it still tells us after 25 years of its publication. So then we will open the floor to our audience here on Zoom, which is numerous and has a lot of new faces today, which is great to see. So without further ado, let me open the floor to Lucía Pinto, who will make a short contribution on one of the chapters of the book. All right, the floor is yours, Lucía.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Hello, everyone. You can hear me well? Okay, thank you. Okay, I want to thank first Victor for the organization of this meeting, and it is an honor to be in the celebration of this wonderful book with the editor Sam Whimster and all of you. I have learned a lot reading the book. So thanks, Sam Whimster and all the writers of the books for it. So I have prepared a short comment. I will read my presentation. So I start. Max Weber and the Culture of Anarchy, published in 1999, give us the opportunity to access to deeply dimensions of Weber thinking. These are dimensions that are not always in the mainstream, and this is something to celebrate. So here we are. We can say the other Weber, the anarchist Weber. What is most interesting is that the book does this with a methodological approach, which leads to the life, to the experience of Weber in Ascona, Switzerland, over the Easters of 1913 and 1914. The book makes connection between politics and culture in a very fruitful way. It makes the reader think, broaden their political imagination. It gives place to political voices that are on the margins, taking to our present categories of community, justice, democracy, and ethics, which were in most cases forgotten. I want to point out two dimensions of the book that I found extremely interesting. The first is about democracy, and the second is about the influence of Weber in anarchist thinkers. So the first, democracy. I read the chapter 8 of the book with a lot of attention. The chapter is, the title of the chapter is Weber and Dostoevsky on Church, Sect, and Democracy, written by Charles Turner. It caught my attention for the concept of democracy and its relationship with the religion. The chapter begins with the expression elective affinities from Goethe, as we know, the expression that Weber uses to describe the relationship between capitalism and Protestantism, rejecting monocausal explanation. In The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, a book that almost all the German intellectuality of the 20th century learned. The chapter is about the elective affinities between Weber formulations of the relationships between church, sect, and democracy, and the work of Dostoevsky. The author, Charles Turner, mentions the fact that Weber read The Brothers Karamazov, a book that he refers both in contributions to the discussion of the first German Sociologist Conference in 1910, after Troelsch's speech, and in the second, in a letter to Marianne Weber that he writes from Ascona in 1914. So 1910 and 1914. The author says that Weber took from Dostoevsky, I quote, an awareness of the tragic irreconcilability of opposed value positions and a corresponding ability to do equal justice to rival worldviews. In the contribution of 1910, Weber refers to the brotherly love of Russian Orthodox Church. A way, and I quote, not to some, I quote Weber, sorry, a way not to some sort of social effect, which is quite irrelevant, but to a knowledge of the meaning of the word, to a mystical relationship with God. This is quite different from the individualism of Calvinism. These are two different kinds of Christianity. We can say follow Turner, the Russian Orthodox Church, and Calvinism. Regarding this, Turner says, and I quote, when the burden of achieving that consistency in an increasingly complex and differentiated world seemed intolerable, Weber's thought would frequently turn to the Russians he knew in Heidelberg and to the nihilistic and anarchist of Dostoevsky novels. What appears in The Grand Inquisitor is the characteristic of Dostoevsky novels. It is dualism between two principles claiming universality. One leads to the necessity of full domination, the other to ethic of brotherliness and the responsibility of the individual for the fate of the other. Turner says, on the one hand, authoritarian mystery, obscurity, and lies, on the other, the full presence of openness, clarity, and honesty. Weber understands the inevitability of domination, considering the rationalization process. So, he was not an anarchist, but neither does he subscribe to democracy as domination. There is another concept of democracy which Turner clarifies. In his words, neither the Hobbesian nor the Rousseauian tradition contains a theory of political education appropriate to a democratic policy as Weber understood it. It is very interesting that the chapter refers to Weber's theory of democracy. For the author, there is a relationship between sect, church, and democracy in Weber's work. I quote, Weber's work contained a conception of democracy animated by the tension between the ethical clarness of the church member and the intensity of the sectarian. I am not quite sure whether there is in Weber's work a theory like this, a theory of democracy. In other words, if there is one theory of democracy. A few months ago, Edith Hanke gave a master session about it for Weber Scholars Network. I think the most interesting of this chapter is that bring us to the relationship between social and political democracy. And this is something very necessary in our time and something very important to think democracy in Weber. He mentions, Charles Turner, Weber's asceticism toward democracy as a formal set of producers. In his article, Suffrage and Democracy in Germany, written in 1917, he was concerned about the political education, maturity, and judgment of all citizens, not only leaders. This is a very important point. It is worth noting that political education is a relevant factor, but Weber rarely returns to it. In his political text, the problem of the selection of the leaders becomes more important than the problem of the political education of the people. For this reason, the chapter of Turner is extremely relevant. As Turner says, the distinct feature of his argument is the description of the process of social democratization. Here, a set of qualities peculiar to an aristocracy is diffused, download by the process of imitation. Weber is making a crucial point about the relationship between democracy as a political form and democratic social form. The relevant gesture, I think, of Turner is thinking not only in democracy as a form of government, but in democratic citizenship. This is something very important for our time. So now I make the second comment, it is shorter, about the influence of Weber in anarchist thinkers. As I say, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism make a great influence in the German intellectuality of the 20th century. Walter Benjamin was one of the authors that refers to the relationship between capitalism and religion that Weber analyzed. Just to add to the Weber and anarchist debate we are having today, I want to highlight that when Benjamin quotes Weber in Capitalism as Religion, a text of 1921, he had recently published his most anarchist text, we can say, that was Critique of Violence in the Archive of Social Science and Social Politics, founded by Weber. This article was asked by Emil Lederer. I think the archive founded by Weber was also the platform for anarchist ideas also. This is something that the book always get back to it, yes, the relationship between Weber and anarchist ideas. Benjamin not only published in the archive, but also got in touch with Marian Weber's circle in Heidelberg. In 1921, he was in Heidelberg from June to August. He was in contact with Emil Lederer, and he attended meetings in Marianne Weber's house. Weber was already dead. In that year, he also wrote Capitalism as Religion, the text which he quoted Max Weber. And the next year, in 1922, he returned to Heidelberg. He gave a talk about poetry in the group of Marianne Weber with no success at all. He wrote to Gershom Scholem and said it was a disaster. And he also dismissed the possibility of doing the habilitation in Heidelberg with Alfred Weber, which was his original idea. So I think this book makes us think in a lot of authors, movements, ideas that were influenced by Weber. We can say there are a lot of heretical followers of Weber that is very important for our time to consider. Finally, we need to go back to Weber to think our contemporary social political development problems. We need his concept and categories, not to repeat Weber's work, but to use it in the sense of thinking with him, reading, discussing. This book, Max Weber and the Culture of Anarchy, did it. And I think we must do our best to do it too. I think that the concern, the honest concern about our time will save us from being specialists without spirit, which was one of Weber's highest worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. Thanks for that great contribution and calling attention to the present. I also, during the reading, felt there were a lot of echoes of things we were reflecting on today, beyond academia. Okay, Yannis, it's you have the floor now.
Yes, thank you, Victor. Good afternoon, everyone from Athens. Let me start by saying that I feel very happy and honored to be here as a discussant today for the 25th anniversary of the publishing of Max Weber and the Culture of Anarchy, a unique work edited by Sam Whimster. The existence of this collective work had been quite important for me during the writing of my dissertation. The reason is the following. As I was working on the intellectual affinities that connect Max Weber and Cornelius Castoriadis, a Greek-French political philosopher who was in favor of radical democracy and self-management, colleagues often used to look at me suspiciously. How could one possibly connect Weber, a sui generis liberal, if not conservative and nationalist, to Castoriadis, a proponent of direct democracy and council socialism? In this context, Sam Whimster's collective volume made me feel less alone and persuaded me that I was not chasing my own tail. Against this background, let me open a parenthesis and make an observation on the current political status of Weber studies. One thing that has not stopped impressing me since I joined Weber Scholars Network is the political orientation of its younger members. To put it in a rather simplistic way, I would say that while the old guard of the experienced and well-known Weber scholars tend to place themselves within the liberal tradition, we can think here of Kari Palonen, for example, or perhaps in the camp of social democracy, younger Weber scholars tend to approach Weber from a more radical political point of departure. This is, for instance, true for Lucia, Victor, and myself, but also for other young members of the network, such as Octavio Mazul and others. I think this has interesting implications for the contemporary sociology of knowledge and perhaps for the sociology of contemporary academia. In this context, the book Sam Whimster edited and we're discussing today gains new relevance and appears as an important forerunner. Let me now come briefly to the 7th chapter of this book. Lucia talked about Weber and Dostoevsky. In a way, I'm going to talk about Weber and Tolstoy, using as a point of departure the 7th, as I already mentioned, chapter of the book, written by our very own Edith Hanke and entitled Max Weber, Leo Tolstoy, and the Mountain of Truth. In this chapter, Edith follows the fascinating life of Ernst Frick, a Swiss anarchist, syndicalist, newspaper editor, and painter, who since 1911 found himself living in Ascona, along with his companion, Frida Gross, her son Peter, and their daughter Eva Verena. At first, Weber was supposed to help Frick and Frida Gross in their legal adventure, as Frida was facing the risk of losing custody of her son. However, coming to know Frick and estimating his personal integrity, Weber soon enough found himself interested in Frick's life orientation and worldview in a more profound way. They had long discussions on questions of Lebensführung, life conduct, and Weber seems to have identified a sort of Tolstoyan ethics as the guiding principle in Frick's life. As Edith Hanke writes, Max Weber saw Frick in the light of Tolstoy's ideal and sought to measure him by it. What is very interesting in Edith's contribution to the book is that through the brief yet detailed narration of Ernst Frick's story, she manages not only to reconstruct some of the most important aspects of Weber's take on Tolstoy, but also to explore possible convergences and divergences between Tolstoyan pacifism, Ernst Frick's political activism, and Gustav Landauer's political thought. Frick had indeed contacts with Landauer, and they both referred to Tolstoy's anarchism, although Frick rejected its religious and non-violent foundations. Let us remember here that sometimes Weber, in his analysis of charismatic authority, speaks of a spirit, Geist, that animates the community, an idea in some respects quite similar to the central concept of Gustav Landauer, despite, of course, their enormous political differences. Combining Edith's analysis with a very interesting information provided by Carl Levy in the 4th chapter of the book regarding the intersection of Weber's environment with circles that included revolutionary figures such as Landauer, Ernst Bloch, Kurt Hiller, Georg Lukács, and of course Ernst Toller, we can shape a good idea for the intellectual and political atmosphere in Germany during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In any case, the element Weber identified Tolstoyan ethics, and perhaps to some degree Frick's life and political engagement with, was the element of rigorous consistency. Weber indeed showed great respect for people who remained consistent with their own values and were ready to pay the price that came along with their guiding principles, even if he personally rejected those principles. From this standpoint, Tolstoy represents a positive example of Gesinnungsethik, the ethics of conviction. As Edith Hanke writes, in the midst of the World War, at the time when pacifists were increasingly inclined to invoke Tolstoy, Weber employed Tolstoy, the man whose ethic was based upon conviction, as a weapon against those who were lukewarm and half-hearted. Of course, Weber himself was closer to the ethics of responsibility, since he conceived politics as an affair that always involves violence and power relations, hence necessitating the computation of the foreseeable consequences of every action. The ethics of pure conviction is not suitable for this world, which is not governed by the God of goodness. However, Edith concludes, there might still be a place for people like Tolstoy and Frick, far away, among virtuosi, on the mountain of truth. Mountain of Truth was the name of this community Weber visited, and is placed at the center of Max Weber and the Culture of Anarchy. At the same time, following Edith, we can see how Weber spotted a contradiction between Frick's polyamorous life and ideas and his effort to support a socialist community based in the solidarity of brotherly love, which he also connected to Tolstoy's paradigm. We can discuss later on this question, which requires more time and space. However, it can be noted that Weber touches upon it in his Zwischenbetrachtung. We can see here how personal questions and theoretical issues are for Weber intertwined and articulated in this case. A lot more could be said on Weber and Tolstoy, some followers of whom were among the founders of the community of Monte Verita. Let us, for example, remember that Weber also quotes Tolstoy in a loose manner towards the end of his famous lecture on science as a vocation, attributing to him the idea that science cannot show us how to live our lives. Weber also planned to publish a book on Tolstoy, an ambition never realized. In any case, we can reflect upon Martin Green's observation in the 3rd chapter of the book, according to which, in Weber's thought, we encounter mainly not Tolstoy, the great erotic novelist, but the late Tolstoy, the Christian radical pacifist. But since our goal here today is not to have an extensive description of the chapters of the book, but rather to pose some questions on the relevance of Sam Whimster collection on Max Weber and the Culture of Anarchy, I will end this short presentation with a question addressed to the editor of this monumental work, but also to all of us. If, as Sam Whimster wrote in his note on today's event, it's a short note published in the website of Weber Scholars Network. So he wrote that this edited volume was in a way a product of cultural, political, and anarchist threads that were brought together at a Weber study group in 1998. If this is true, what is the driving force behind Weber and the new culture of anarchy, or at least the new culture of radicality I tried to describe in the beginning? Why are we inclined today to read Weber from a radical perspective? And why do young scholars occupying themselves with radical politics engage more and more often with Weberian concepts? After all, what are the inherent characteristics of Weber's thought that make him inspire critical thinkers over the course of time? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yannis. All right, it's my turn to make a short contribution before we open the floor to Sam. Basically, I want to go and reflect a little bit on the place of Weber and the Culture of Anarchy and the overall literature on Weber, which again, despite being vast, has a very special place for this book, which is why we wanted to do something on its 25th anniversary. I'll be reflecting more on Sam's introduction and very briefly on Carl Levy's chapter. But I mean, I really recommend this. This is still a very compelling intervention, the one by Sam. It's not just an introduction to the book, as a typical introduction to a collective volume is, where you have maybe the summaries of the chapters that will follow. There's a wider reflection on what Weber's dialogue with this particular community of radicals, libertarians, reformers of all kinds, means to understand his trajectory and his place actually in overall political and social thought. And not only does Sam do that, there's also a kind of collective biography of all these figures, which are more or less obscure, but are close to figures we know much, which are very well known. So people who interacted with Freud, with Jung, who had a direct participation in revolutions. And even though these figures have this significance, they usually are relegated to the margins of any kind of biographical treatment of Weber. And so they're very literally left to the footnotes as kind of interesting anecdotes that, you know, these colorful figures passed through Weber's life and he interacted with them. It's seen as a curiosity. Sam quotes specifically Wolfgang Schluchter, who literally only deals with these occasions in the footnotes of his work. And what Sam is doing with this book, along with all these incredible contributors, is bringing these dialogue partners and interlocutors from the margins to the center in a way. So from kind of interesting footnotes and kind of anecdotal fodder to a more significant factor of his trajectory, to something that tells us more about who he was as a thinker and as an individual, but also about the relationship between politics and culture in Imperial Germany. And I guess he makes the argument that we should take the full spectrum of political thought and action in life in that society to understand it, that even if these figures were in a way very small minorities or groups that were numerically, you know, not very significant, that they have more to say about that reality than we give them credit for, and also they speak to our reality in a way more than other more established figures that we keep coming back to from that constellation. And so, I just want to quote one passage from Sam's introduction that I guess captures this very, very clearly. Why we have to engage with these figures to understand Weber, beyond this idea of just a curiosity. So, quoting Sam here, Weber was one voice in a much wider chorus of voices looking for a reform of ways of living and conduct that would circumvent an unresponsive politics and the modernizing structures of society. Weber research has tended to consign other voices as foils, lightweights, dimwits, misguided enthusiasts, or other epithets of marginalization, and this has created a disservice to Weber himself. His views, in no small part, developed in dialogue with the voices on the margin. So leaving aside the arrogance that voices marginal to Weber were wrong, and the uncritical acceptance that Weber was always right, a major underestimation of the severity of the crisis in Wilhelmine Germany is perpetrated. Weber and his reform solutions implied that through rational social policy, a more progressive and Whigist view could have prevailed, and there is much evidence to the contrary. And then Sam goes on to say that avant-gardes were not simply the reactivity of the excluded, which is largely the portraying their historiography. Instead, they were pitching for their own redefinition of modernity, and to this end, were creating and deploying innovative artifacts, new forms in art, literature, lifestyle, and politics, producing entirely new aesthetic and ethical sensibilities. And I think this raises a lot of interesting questions. One, about the Weber reception and its character, let's say, in the 80s and 90s, which tended to favor Weber as this figure of the reformer, the liberal reformer who, had we listened to him, Germany would have found a better path beyond the extremes, and so in a way to canonize him in that role. And I think that has a lot to do with the intellectual climate of West Germany in the 80s, and then especially after reunification, where you're sort of looking for kind of liberal forefathers to be inspired by. In a way, that was already the case in the 50s and 60s. That's why Wolfgang Mommsen's book on Max Weber and German politics created so much controversy. It was already, the fact that he was already pointing to the nationalist and more problematic tendencies in Weber was already causing a lot of, was coming in, was in a way disturbing this kind of canonized image, or canonical image, Whiggish, we could say, as Sam did. So there's, in a way, the prioritization of Weber the liberal sheds light more on its reception than on Weber himself. But the question still remains: why did Weber engage with these figures, and why were they also very interested in him? So in a way, the question that Yannis raises, why the younger Weber scholars tend to approach Weber from a more radical position, reflects also the kind of magnetism that he had to all these radical thinkers of his time. So, and I feel this is a question that remains open. Maybe maybe because he deals so well in ambiguity and ambivalence. Perhaps also because he comes in as a sort of realist corrective to these more ethically centered positions, and this would apply for today as well. But anyway, one topic that Sam raises is that in that encounter there's a missed opportunity for Weber, that even though he engaged with these figures, he could never entirely betray his class or his national liberal upbringing. And this is very similar to his stance regarding social democrats, which is what I studied, where he could never make the leap to join the underdogs, as Wolfgang Mommsen put it. There was something that held him back, more specific, and it was usually elements of his perspective tied to this national liberal upbringing, where nationalism and a certain kind of essentialist view of Germanness kind of held him back. And this is what, and we're dealing with a situation, this encounter happens in the eve of the First World War, and so it was the missed opportunity of another Germany that would have avoided, that had it prevailed somehow, would have avoided the catastrophe that follows right after, and that leads to further catastrophes into the 20th century, of course. And so even in the case where he defends Frieda Gross from her tyrannical father-in-law, something that Sam recounts, who is trying to take away her children from her because she's living with another man who she's not married to, he still kind of does that as a form of chivalry, and so as part of his grand bourgeois kind of habitus, not because of maybe his commitment to women's rights, which is an element of his trajectory as well that hasn't been featured enough, of course, not least through the influence of Marianne Weber. So very quickly, going to Karl Levy's chapter, I like the fact that Karl Levy is harsher with Weber because of that missed opportunity than most of the literature is. The literature tends to portray Weber's tragedy, the fact that he is this thinker of politics and of political vocation and of domination, but who fails as a politician, as the ultimate tragedy. That tends to project his tragedy as the ultimate tragedy of that pre-Weimar Germany. And Karl Levy is very begs to differ in the sense of shedding light on Ernst Toller and saying that, in a way, he lived the same dilemmas between ethics and an ethics of conviction and responsibility in a more compelling and fruitful way than Weber himself did, and perhaps in a deeper way. So very quickly, Toller was a lifelong pacifist, but who was drafted as a soldier and fought in World War One. Returns to Germany, is involved in the peace movement while Germany is still at war, and becomes involved in the revolutionary activity in 1918. Before he very concretely becomes a military commander during the Bavarian Council Republic and organizes the defense of Munich. Very literally as a commander of the Red Army. So the pacifist becomes the commander of the Red Army. And despite that, you don't see in Toller's trajectory, let's say, a betrayal, the confirmation of Weber's realism, that you cannot just defend, that defending an ethics of conviction based on pacifism the only coherent stance would be that of a saint. Toller does get into the fray, because he feels that is what's he's being called to do, but he refused, nevertheless, to use violence indiscriminately. In his case, he refuses, for example, to execute hostages, and this despite the threats that are presented to this Council Republic, and indeed it will be suppressed, and there will be a wave of white terror in its wake after that. So I very much like the fact that what Karl Levy raises, just a short quote here, unlike Weber or the KPD or the German communists, who made the presupposition of the necessity of using violence, Toller's position was ethically consistent throughout. Toller's Masses and the Man, so his book, is a genuine opposition between the two ethics and had nothing to do with Weber's realism, which Karl Levy, I think, accurately portrays as that at least one dimension of his realism is not the pervasive nature of modern bureaucratization or the growth of state power, so having to account for these things and accepting them as realities, but the specific needs of the German state in the confusing and alarming autumn of 1918. So if we see these figures, again, it's a filter through to Weber's trajectory that perhaps makes him a more compelling figure, while at the same time breaking with the more canonical views of him. And I see a lot of parallels also in this treatment of Ernst Toller with the trajectory of Georg Lukács, who will also go from a kind of dilemma between ethics of conviction and responsibility to understanding that they join a collective movement and entering the fray and making and choosing, let's say, a political camp in accordance with his values and accepting the consequences of that is a more fruitful, let's say, is a more fruitful resolution to the dilemmas, to the binaries that Weber raised. At least that's what the next generation considered, with all the consequences that entailed. But that's where I'm gonna end it. And before I open the floor to Sam, I had a couple of questions as well, which is, you talked about Weber's missed opportunity in the encounter with these radical figures. Was there also a missed opportunity for Weber's scholarship in the wake of this book? So I was wondering, what was the book's reception? Do you think, what was the reaction by all kinds of Weberians to it? And you spoke about the genesis of the book in the 90s. My second question would be, maybe does the reception have something to do, or the reception or lack thereof, with the context between 99 and 2008, which was perhaps unfavorable for its reception? So we still have the tail end of this kind of celebratory, triumphant neoliberal capitalism since the 90s, but now we have September 11th, we have war again, war in Iraq, and so there's this malaise that's growing. You have the anti-globalization movement, and this all comes to a head in a way in the crisis of 2008, which brings capitalism back into the discussion, right? So I was wondering if you could talk about the reception of the book as well. But I'll leave it there. So Sam, we're all really honored to celebrate the publication of this book, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it and discussing with you.
Yeah, sorry, Victor. Can I add a question to Sam, Mr.?
Of course.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I want to ask to, in addition to Yannis and Victor, and in a similar way, that we had the great opportunity to have Sam Whimster here. You wrote in the preface or in the text that for the Weber Scholar Network blog, that the origins of this book can be traced back to 1992, when you visit the Prussian Secret State Archive in Messerburg. The context was the dissolution of the United Soviets, and in the text blog, you wonder about the relevance of the state in a world where the Cold War has just ended. From 1999 to now, as Victor say, the world has changed. 2 years later was September 11 attack in the United States, the invasion to Iraq, 2016 the Brexit, 2018 subprime crisis, 2019 coronavirus crisis, 2020 Russian invasion in Ukraine. So when I think in these events, I think that they put the relevance of the state in the first place. That could be one interpretation. There was an anarchist moment in 1913, before the First World War, as Sam Whimster say in the introduction of the book. Then an anarchist movement in 1990s, after the Cold War. The question is, what do you think about the relevance of the state today? And do you think there is place for something like an anarchist moment today, as Yannis says? Thank you.
Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, well, I'm delighted that you're doing this, Victor, and thank you for all those questions. It's quite an honor, actually, to come back and still be alive and talk about it. I'll just say something to begin with about the circumstances, which Lucia has also picked up on, but 1998, you start thinking about these things during the 1990s. I was only in Leipzig because...
No, I was just going to ask you if your camera's off.
I was just... Let's... Stop video. How about
there
now?
We go. Yeah.
Okay. And you can hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Okay. So I was in Leipzig in 1992, basically teaching at the Marxism-Leninism Institute in that tower on the sort of main square. And, one clearly felt that the world had changed. And it was fairly accidental, actually, that I opened a file at the Merseburg archive, which was Max Weber and Frieda Gross. And so I got copies of that, and that led me to Ascona, literally and physically and mentally. And then you realize that, Weber, the theme that's coming out in this discussion is Weber, is there another Weber beyond the political economist, the politician, the state theorist? And Victor, yourself, you've just raised that, that Weber can't really tear himself away from being an embodiment of the cultural middle class who should really be leading the state. Nevertheless, he's attracted to all these people. He gets into conversations with them which are really deep, the deepest of which, has already been said, is with Ernst Frick, but also Toller. Those take the conversations in ways that you couldn't really imagine just reading the sort of normal reception literature, which had been dominated really by Wolfgang Mommsen. And then in British sociology, it had always been, should one have a Marxist inclined sociology, or was Weber a bourgeois sociologist? I mean, it was kind of, I was brought up in that atmosphere, and at the London School of Economics, it was quite radical in those days. And somehow this cultural, this countercultural Weber was entirely different, opened up new possibilities. And the possibilities were there, if you like, after the Cold War. You could do anything you want. The state wasn't important. And people were running down their armies, their military expenditure, their nuclear warheads. It was a pacifist directed future, it seemed, at the geopolitical level, which raised the question of, I remember being on a train journey somewhere, I think from Augsburg, with Ulrich Linzer, the German anarchist historian who's written on Musum. And he was basically saying, well, why are you doing this? It doesn't really sound like Weber to me. And I said, well, it's, anarchist lifestyles is the creative choice. And I remember doing something on a workshop, actually it was a conference on the East End of London, which had become very artistic and bohemian. It was run down, so you had sort of communal activities, and how were these communes defining themselves? How were they as ways of living? And they were converting warehouses, creating communal spaces, and creating new art forms. And so anarchism was actually a real possibility as a lifestyle. And this is, of course, what Weber saw in Ascona. You had the literally back to nature people, the naturists. Then you had more structured anarchism of Landauer, who clearly was trying to map out a way of how people could live independently of the state. Now, if you live independently of the state, you have to have some kind of communal theory. It doesn't make itself up. And Landauer provided that. It was a serious thinker. You can see the connection between him and Frick, Ernst Frick. They're talking about the possibilities of what an aesthetic lifestyle would be. And in a sense, the motivating forces for new forms of living independent of the state has to come from art, drama, the creative arts, as we call them. Now, Weber himself clearly was, he could see that, but I think Victor put it quite well, that he couldn't bring himself not so much to this sort of bottom-up democracy. I don't think he could really bring himself to involve himself in a kind of new aesthetics of expressionism, which had appeared at that point. And Toller, of course, is was a famous expressionist dramatist. He didn't quite understand it. And it's this, this is the interesting bit, that you have to push it beyond Weber. Weber's quite censorious about what happens at the social level, the social ethic level. So to go back to the question of the social ethic that Lucía raises, you've got the social ethic, which these days I think has to provide the basis for social democracy. That's what we seem to be saying. And then you have Weber's political ethic, which is really defined by the state and people of responsibility within the state. Well, that doesn't really work at the moment. And so it's a question of that there's a kind of deficiency with Weber. And Troeltsch is the more interesting figure if you're going to try and find a social ethic that translates into politics, the politics of community. I mean, Weber misses the opportunity when he talks about Gladstone and liberalism. Gladstone's, the British Prime Minister and liberal political leader, dominant force in late 19th century Victorian politics. His political background, or if you like, his movement, was based on non-conformist, middle-class, urban citizens. They had not a Calvinist Protestant ethic, but a Protestant ethic that said society must change. We need political representation. We want a society that is better. We want urban, the whole social reform movement, which you get in Germany and in America in the social gospel. You have it in Germany with Naumann and Helena Weber. And in England, it's really the sort of urban-based, town-based liberalism of non-conformists citizens. And that seems to me, I mean, that opportunity is gone now, and it drove the late part of the 19th century and made Britain a progressive country in those respects. And Weber can't quite make the link. He's always stuck in the sort of Calvinist mentality. And he makes the link, of course, in the 17th century, that the nonconformist conscience and the way in which the nonconformist conscience makes politics much more experiential. And so you get the new model army under Cromwell, the English Civil War, the Levellers, who propose a form of citizen democracy for the first time, and also republicanism, that the king must go because the king represents an appropriation of the divine, which is inappropriate for the nonconformist radicals.
Sam, just to interrupt you, we seem to have lost your video.
Why that's happening? Has it come back?
Not yet. Maybe turn it on and off. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
It's come back on.
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
So I think, that the question is that sort of from as has been said, from 1992 to 1908 to 2008, we had the possibility of different lifestyles. And they could have been developed, and that was the potential of the book. The book wasn't really reviewed. there was a review in the European Journal of Sociology by, I think it was by Bellamy, who's now a professor at University College. But I remember having a conversation with the publisher, Macmillan, and we were both a bit disappointed that, you know, it hadn't really taken off. And it may be, well, you know, that just the inertia of the previous Faber reception, what wasn't there, you know, was still in place. And I think also people didn't realize that they were in a decade or so of opportunity. You know, they just treated it as the new normal, not as the creative opportunity in which you must act before some other person fills the political vacuum. And even the way in which the political vacuum filled was fairly innocuous. It came through neoliberalism, which took us back to political economy, which is where we are now, unfortunately. And neoliberalism sprung up as the Washington Consensus, also I think in 1992, wasn't it? About that time. And the idea was, you know, prosperity would be shared around the globe. And so in that sense, neoliberalism proved to be, you couldn't really see that it was a danger. And it crept up on us, and it's led us to the new plutocracy, which is extremely unfortunate. And it's shut off the possibilities that were there in those 2 short decades. So looking back, it's slightly sad experience, traurig, yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there. And once again, thank you for all your questions. Hang on, did I miss something? Yes, Yannis, the direct democracy in the councils. Well, yes, that was Landau. And it is the challenge of direct democracy. And this is what the Weber Network has been talking about, that trying to make a Democrat out of Max Weber is quite hard. I go the citizen route, that you got to see him as the theorist of citizenship. But as a natural Democrat, as seeing the impulses coming from below, that's where he was weak, even though he had examples, living examples in front of his eyes, at Ascona and the people he was speaking to. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks so much for your intervention. Maybe we could say that if the reception wasn't ready for the book at that point, I guess we're ready for it now. I guess the potential of the book, or the insights that are there that it contains, are more compelling now for some reason. Now that this plutocracy is the ruling strata worldwide. But let me open the floor to questions. We have a lot of people here at the session. Does anybody want to make a question? You can write it on the chat, or raise your hand and just speak directly with Sam. Really looking forward to it. In the meantime, yeah, I guess exactly what you were saying, Sam. In a way, he can't identify with these impulses from below, which somehow has give a democratic stance its spine, or some kind of spine. The only impulse from below, or at least the only collective element he's willing to allow himself to be subject to, or he's willing to be a part of, is this kind of nationalism, which, even though that has many guises, was about to be co-opted by the worst kind of far-right politics in Germany, right? And so the space he hoped to to be able to create some kind of collective basis for his viewpoints was in a way the wrong bet, or at least it would be the basis for something that went in a direction that I guess he would not have followed, but that we know very well where that ended. Even though, and that's the whole point, I guess, even today with Germany, you always have to you always have to remind, in a way, especially the Germans of today, I have to say, that there were other options, that there were other pathways, that there were figures that represented another project, democratic figures, socialists, reformers of all kinds, and that it wasn't Germanist in itself, but the way that Germanist was appropriated that led to all the tragedies that followed. But that we have always to remember that the issue is not in a way Germanist, but how that Germanist is experienced and or acted upon, and that there were alternatives, including to Weber himself was kind of in the middle of them, but never made the choice. he bet on the wrong class, on the wrong political camp, on the wrong collectivity in the case of the nation as he saw it. But just a reflection. Here we have Aaron, who wants. Go ahead, Aaron. And
Yeah.
Introduce yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself?
Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Aaron French. I'm in religious studies at the University of Erfurt. And I had a question about Weber and the... well, first of all, I wanted to say that I'm also very thankful for this book, because when I wrote my dissertation, I did a chapter on Weber and Ascona, and especially in English, there is nothing else really. There's a little bit, but nothing really devoted to this topic. So it was extremely helpful for me. And then, of course, you can find things in other books about Ascona, but in terms of a book about like Weber and Ascona, this was really the one that you had to go to. And so I was very thankful for that. My question, I guess, is about the perspective of Weber from some of these other more radical anarchists or whatever. And especially in connection with like the revolution in Munich. So I know that Weber encountered these anarchist tendencies in Ascona, but he also encountered them in Munich. And for example, when he took the position there and when he moved there, was right when these activities were really going on in a major way, and he was right there in the middle of it. So I've been trying to do some research about that, about how those involved in the revolution there in the council's movement viewed Weber, and they seem to have viewed him, I guess, the way that Weber viewed them. But at the same time, they also seemed to be like glad he was coming and to like being at his lectures and so on. So I was just wondering where that piece kind of fits into Weber and anarchy, his time in Munich during the council republics and so forth. So thank you very much.
Do you want to go ahead and answer, Sam, or should we get Carl Levy's question, who had also raised his hand?
Carl, do you want to answer that one?
Guess I should take that off too. Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I think you're probably better. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you introduce
Good.
yourself, Carl?
What? Sorry?
Can you introduce yourself?
Carl Levy,
Yeah.
retired from Goldsmiths College. And I'm not that much of an expert on German anarchism. I mean, I think Sam might be more into this, but I mean, my point would be that on the general picture, not answering that question, but what Sam was talking about, the 90s and up to the, crisis in 2008, I would say I disagree with Sam to some extent about, I mean, there were two inflection points. One, the fall of the wall, 1989-92, but also 2009 to 2011, 12, 13, the Occupy movement, which was like kind of 1848 of its day. And that actually was all about performative direct democracy. It was not even about, it didn't even have any demands. Its demands were just to live itself out through democratic practice. But I would say, the only thing I would say is that at the same time you had this post-Cold War world, you also had a new wave of anarchism or anarchist thought. It's the first time, building up from maybe the 68 generation, where you have a lot of anarchist academics or people using anarchism for their careers, I put it that way, and that was legitimately accepted in North America and in Britain and elsewhere in the world. I'm thinking, of course, of the late, great David Graeber, for one who was at Goldsmiths for a while, and many other people. And I would just say that the way I got into it was through that. I mean, the discovery of Weber was also through this revival of anarchism. And for me, the Weber introduction to Weber was first of all through a kind of through C. Wright Mills, actually, when I was a young student in the 60s and early 70s. And C. Wright Mills himself, I've been writing about this now, was, as he said, a goddamn anarchist. So the snake bites its own tail. The man who introduces, well, he and somebody else, who sort of ripped off the other guy, introduces Weber to a bigger audience in the United States, post-Cold War audience, is a goddamn anarchist. So the anarchist connection and Weber and Mills goes, is not only at the time of Ascona, but in this era. And then I would also just say very briefly that for me, the other connection was with Gramsci. And that's where I met Sam Whimster at the famous Gramsci, Weber and his Contemporaries, 1984, at the German Historical Institute in London. And, as I said, and many other people have said, that, Gramsci was the Marxist Max Weber, basically, essentially. And that's what I've been writing about on and off. So for me, I got introduced for Weber through a kind of weird nexus of the libertarian wing of the New Left of the 60s and 70s, not the people that lost their minds and became mad Maoists and all the rest of it, but the participatory democracy chaps and chapesses, women, men. And that, for over 30 or 40 years, I kept coming back to it in various different forms, and eventually ran into Sam Whimster and, did that. But Weber is now, very much tied to a whole wave generation of people who write about social sciences and anarchism now. I mean, there are several books on social science and anarchism. I mean, I edited another book called The Anarchist Imagination, which of course is an homage to C. Wright Mills, because he had his own sociological imagination. So I guess my interaction with this book was through that, my decades worth interest in the interaction between anarchism, well, as an historian, a historian of anarchism of Italy and elsewhere, but also of anarchism in the social sciences. And so I think, I guess with Sam, I would say that it was always already there in the 60s and 70s, in a certain kind of libertarian New Left. And I think it also survives this 2 decades, as he talks about. So I'm a bit more wary about the periodization, I suppose, of it. I think it's a bit more vigorous and continues the plutocracy, the neoliberalism, all the rest of it. There is now a self-sustaining group of people, generally academics, I must say, who are legitimate in the world of academia, who study anarchism and have written now quite a few books and articles that interact between the social sciences and anarchism and Weber and anarchism. And I think I'm wandering, so I'll stop there.
All right, Sam?
Just on the coming back to the Munich Soviets, Max Weber's studies is just published. Bertram Sheffold's work on the general economic history, the Wirtschaftsgeschichte, yes. And he goes into historical detail about Weber in Munich in 1919. And he basically said that Weber retreated into his shell after Versailles. And the events on the streets, which he's pretty cool about in his letters to Mariana, but you know, there were barricades, hostage taking. It was a very bad time, was that period. So Weber disengages, other than he's caught up in the Kurt Eisner affair.
Yeah.
Kurt Eisner, of course, another socialist anarchist who was resigning when he was assassinated by Count Arco. And Count Arco was condemned to death in a court of law. And there was, rather like the sort of Trump shenanigans that, you know, he never lost the election and Count Arco was innocent. You know, he should be condoned for shooting Kurt Eisner. Weber refuses to go along with this and says the due process of law has to be carried out. I mean, he does actually add further to that. Otherwise, you will make Eisner a martyr. I'm not quite sure I followed his thinking there. But after that, and that causes pandemonium in the university itself. And Weber is seen as a philo-Semite, and as Carl pointed out in his article in the book, anti-Semitism actually got very nasty after the Soviets uprising in the early parts of 1919 in Bavaria and Munich. Thank you, Carl, for your intervention on Gravener. I mean, that is an important person, and his writings are, because and perhaps this is also a way forward, because, you know, I've been very interested in Weber's social economics, in that he's offering a way of analyzing capitalism, which goes back to basic points about human anthropology and the way capitalism and debt works. And there are crossovers there to Weber. I mean, Weber is critical of capitalism.
Yeah.
Never forget that. And indeed, the Max Weber and his contemporaries, but also another book I did with Scott Lash, Rationality and Modernity. I mean, this wasn't in support of modernity. He was pointing out that Weber was saying, we have modernity, this is how it happened. It's come with this mentality. How it happened, you can find out in the Wirtschaftsgeschichte. The mentality is Calvinist, and the combination is lethal. And modernity is not it's not a stabilizing mechanism in itself. And that's perhaps one point of interest for anarchism, indeed for David Graeber, is that if we can find out or research the instability of the mechanisms within the dynamic of capitalism, then that's definitely worth exploring.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, oh, am I on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm there? Yeah? I'm
Yeah.
there. Okay, good. Just wanted to say, the other point I've always felt about Weber is he's got two strategies. One is that he can't help himself but embrace the counterculture. I mean, the whole thing in the biographies now, and you know, that came up then, and you know, at that point, and also in the conference in '84, is that, the attraction of the erotic side of life, which he could not rationalize, reflects his own biography, through his various different affairs and attractions of various women in the period from like 1910 to his death. I guess it made slightly early. I mean, Sam can mention that, but that also feeds into his sociology of religion. The two things meld together. But that's one side. So that's the love and peace side of Max Weber. He can't help himself. I think he's almost ashamed sometimes. Sometimes I can let my hair down. But then the other side of it is really calculating, which is, I'm going to use the anarchists against the socialists. That's how, his old friend, his Whaleward student who wrote about oligarchies, which he criticized for its methodology, but he liked the cannon fodder part of it, which was basically, a way of saying that the social democrats are going to end up as, there's no democracy there. It won't be democracy, and the unions won't be democracy. So he uses the anarchist critique of representative democracy against the social democrats, who of course are competing with the anarchists. So it's a kind of an operation going on there. And the other operation, which I've repeated more recently in a piece about Max Weber, Charisma and Revolution, in this handbook of charisma, which came out a year or two ago in Routledge, is what's Weber really interested in is creating these unique individuals who can who can create dynamic politics, charismatic characters. And that's based on religious interpretation from St. Paul and all the rest of it, which he learns in the 1880s. But what it really comes down to is that he is kind of like a Caesarist. He likes Caesar in some ways. Caesarism was his first love, I think. And these dynamic, dominating individuals need to drink some anarchist wine to translate that into effective politics, because charisma cannot be controlled. Politics is ultimately irrational, and you need an irrational-centered, a series of Caesars who will either dominate authoritarian regimes, but also democratic regimes. So he's using it. He operationalizes it. He exploits anarchism for things. It's this kind of game he plays with them. When he has his juror in his house, and they have these, he wants, argue with me. I want you to argue with me, to Tolo or somebody. Make a good argument about what you're saying. That's what he wanted to do, because he wants to use these ideas for deeply anti-anarchist reasons. I mean, and that's the thing I find utterly fascinating and almost attractive in Max Weber, I must say. It's the part I really like in Max Weber, believe it or not. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. I mean, I think that is the red line in Max Weber. He's got this tension between this thing where he wants to let go, and also because of his various psychological problems, and find some kind of relief. And on the other hand, he wants to use these ideologies to discredit naive forms of democracy, because that's what the anarchists do. The anarchists critique representative. And of course, then he turns it around the other way. He says, of course, what the anarchists suggest to you, the participatory, that's also rubbish. So, he plays them off against each other. And you can see that pretty clearly. And then I think that's the thing that motivated me. And I think an important theme in his relation to anarchism. Unlike C. Wright Mills, by the way, who, again, attracted to Weber, who actually believed this stuff. I mean, he really did believe in direct democracy, participatory democracy. When he wrote his books about the power elite, which was very influenced by Weber and Weber's followers, Talcott Parsons, who, of course, they didn't get along very well, said basically, this guy must be an anarchist, this kind of thing, and and so on and so forth. So if Max Weber was alive and encountered C. Wright Mills and Talcott Parsons, you can ask Sam what he thinks. I mean, he probably would side with Parsons, but I'm sure he'd want to go out for a beer with C. Wright Mills, if you get my drift. Anyway, I'll stop there. I am babbling.
All right, we have a thank you, Carl. It feels very enlightening. Tom Campbell.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for all of this. I'm joining you from the University of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. Um, and I was just, as a personal note, I just noticed that in my own copy of the book, I bought it in June of 1999 in Munich. So that was my first sabbatical. And it really was quite sort of mind shaking for the way I began to rethink what I thought I knew about Weber, particularly with the letters from Ascona, a much more personal Weber than I was used to reading in the biography. But to answer the question, in light of those letters and the commentaries that emerge from them in the anthology, the question of like what interested Weber in the anarchists, I think it's not only political, but it's also generational and intellectual. So generational because I think he's emerging from his neurotic or mental illness, his slump, and he's more engaged with the younger generation of people, possibly anticipating his own return to the classroom. And that's why I think it's significant that in the Value of Freedom essay, which he's working on shortly after this, the main visits to Ascona reported in the letters. He actually says an anarchist would probably be one of the best people to address state, a sociology or a science of the state, because they would take a position outside of it, right? Of course, he's not saying you should bring your anarchism or your feminism or your socialism into the classroom, but he is thinking that is a kind of stance which opens the intellectual, the teacher, to a plurality of different positions on the issues being discussed in the classroom. I think that's interesting to think of. So it's not even a statement of neutrality as much as it is the way we would do it today of trying to include as many different, often abhorrent positions that are being entertained on a university campus or in an undergraduate classroom.
Thanks, Tom. So before going back to Lucía and to Yannis and perhaps to Sam one last time, just wanted to a few short comments on things that appeared in the discussion. Carl spoke about the conjuncture after 2008. I guess I couldn't agree with him more. Maybe, especially for my generation, I'm 38. The time between 2009 and 2018 was a time of successive revolts and revolutions. I would say it's Occupy, yes, but it's also the Arab Spring. That makes it very much the 1848, right? There are many possible analogs, and the fact and the missed opportunities there cost the greatest of them all. But I guess in Europe you also have the kind of reaction to neoliberalism that took shape in different movements and parties, but was ultimately defeated. And then here I have to think of Greece. On the other hand, I mean, in Brazil you have the resurgence of the far right, which is also the phenomenon that kind of the closing of that window after 2008, in a way, comes very much through war, and not only Russia, I would say, but in the way, the notion that you can solve historical issues militarily seems to be, again, viable in people's minds. Despite, and again, not that the 90s was a time of peace, right? We have Yugoslavia, we have the first Iraq War. But anyway, that conjunction, which in Britain includes the Corbyn campaign or the Sanders campaign in the United States, that we feel has closed through a number of defeats, and I guess Weber is appealing as an element of reflecting on those defeats in this moment that we are now, which feels in a way even more complicated than that particular window that was open that you mentioned. Just wanted to mention something on the reception as anarchists, as part of the reception of Max Weber. You mentioned Wright Mills, Carl. I would say Italy has the operaist crowd who's reading Weber very eagerly. Brazil very specifically has one figure called Maurício Trottenberg, who has an essay from 1973 called Bureaucracy and Ideology, and he's very much an anarchist who is utilizing Weber's critique of bureaucracy to make a critique, of course, of the dictatorial state that's in power in Brazil, but also of, let's say, rigid Marxism, Leninism. So he's this anarcho-communist, very much in the tradition of Musa and of Toller, and a very unique figure in our intellectual landscape. And he has this classic essay which we should translate. So this is, I guess, we will find other examples around the world if we look for them. And I guess you kind of made to go back to Aaron's question, why are these radical intellectuals seeking Weber? Why are they in dialogue with him? And I guess who else would you be in dialogue with that is more or less part of the establishment, even if Weber was marginal to it, was just coming back to being a professor, right? So the far left of German academia before the First World War is basically the neo-Kantians, perhaps. That's as critical as you could get, is a kind of ethical Kantian, neo-Kantian position. So there's no space for socialists, of course, no women, and no radicals whatsoever in German academia. And if Lebensphilosophie, like mystical rationalism, doesn't do it for you, I guess Weber is the guy to talk to. I mean, let's remember, like people like Simmel or Werner Sombart were already too critical or too dangerous for the German academic establishment of that time, right? There's no Institute for Social Research. It's not even thinkable. In all of the critical thinking is being done outside academia, with some exceptions, and Weber is one of them, even if he's also on the margins in a way. So I guess from Marx and Bruno Bauer, who could never become professors, and had they become professors, maybe their trajectories would have been different. To the end of the World War I, there are no interlocutors, I guess, for radical thinkers in the kind of liberal enlightened camp, and Weber is that guy. But going back to something that Carl said, Weber would also indulge them, right? He would listen to these younger colleagues and really engage with them, which I guess is also, he wouldn't look down on them. He would be very critical to their views, but without looking down, with great respect for them. Some more than others, Toller more than maybe, or Lukács more than Bloch. So I guess, and so there was, as Tom was talking, there is space in Weber's perspectivism for radical positions, for feminists, socialists, anarchists, and you can latch on to one of those dimensions of his perspectivism for your own, let's say, critical agenda. So maybe for a critique within the left, as in the case of the operaist, or for anarchists criticizing Marxists, you can latch on to him opportunistically, even if for Weber himself that makes kind of a big contradictory whole, right? So I guess that's what I wanted to say in reaction to these really, really interesting interventions. And I'd go back now to the other two speakers, so to Yannis and then to Lucía, so in the reverse order, before giving the floor to Sam for a final word, unless anybody else wants to intervene. But you go ahead, and you can also write your questions. Otherwise, I would open the floor to Yannis, whose reflections I'm curious to listen to.
Okay, Victor, thank you. I'll go ahead, and if someone wants to intervene, please. So first of all, I would like to say that I think that today's discussion and this whole problematization of today's conjecture and bringing back the discussion to Sam Whimster's book is a very Weberian thing to do, I would say, because you know, as the cultural problems change and as the cultural interests change, we set a new light to the past, and that includes books and works that have been published in the past years, and we look at these works from a new perspective, and we can find out more things about the past, but also about our present. But then I would also like to add a final word regarding what interests radical thinkers in Weber's work, in Weber's thinking. So I would say this is a hypothesis, and we can reflect upon it, that we don't necessarily have to look to find the reason. We don't have to look towards the explicitly political writings of Weber. For me, it's the radical, or rather the potentially radical elements in Weber's thought have to do more with his conception of history, that there is no unique direction of history, there is contingency in history. His emphasis on meaning, right? There are always different possible subjective and objective meanings and values, and there is confrontation among them. And of course, as Sam said, to his very lucid diagnosis on Western modernity, right? Modernity and bureaucracy are perhaps for Weber a horizon from which there is no way back, but still he sees it in a very lucid way. And this brings me to another dimension of his work, this call for intellectual honesty, right? This intellektuelle Rechtschaffenheit plicht for Weber is very important. And even if he thinks that capitalism or bureaucracy is a necessary horizon for our era, he doesn't mask things. He doesn't try to, you know, present things better than they are. So maybe in order to discern the reasons why Weber had always such an appeal in radical thinkers, we have to look in broader things, broader elements of his way of thinking and of his theory, and not only to his explicitly or strictly political writings.
Fantastic, Yannis. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Lucia, we have a question here in the chat. Oh, it's just a comment by Carl. Also, the connection between new class theory, Weber, and the unorthodox left, so Alvin Goldner, for example. And then it's rather problematic usage by the neoliberal and even quasi-Trumpist right. Yes, this was also one avenue for me when I wrote and edited Socialism and the Intelligentsia in the mid-80s. For sure. The far right has also quoted Weber against academics who are too critical here in Brazil as well, I would say. It's a misappropriation, I would call that. But Lucia, would you like to say some words?
Yeah, thank you. Just a few words. I want to thank again to Sam Whimster for this book and for this so interesting conversation and all the people. I think that the book enables us to be in the same conversation. Authors like Weber, Landauer, Bloch, Benjamin, Wright Mills. So I think this is a richness which is in the book, and we give its relevance today in our meeting. So, and I was thinking just a word about the reception of the book. Just for curiosity, I searched the book in the libraries in Argentina, and unfortunately there isn't So Max Weber and the Culture of Anarchy isn't in Argentina. I searched the National Library and all the libraries of University of Buenos Aires, and I get this notice. So and another word, just the last one. I agree with most of Victor and Yannis had said. Something about why we are interested in Weber. I have raised this question to me so many times, and I am glad to share this interesting in Weber with you. I think at least there are perhaps two ways I came to Weber. One, I think, if one concern about the poverty, the people on the margins, the development process, one are thinking in capitalism, and if we think in capitalism, we must read Weber. So we came Weber through the study of capitalism, and then a world is open, and then you get fascinated with Weber. But I think if you are interested in capitalism, just to criticize it, to legitimate, to do something with capitalism, you must read Weber. And I think there is another thing that caught my attention in Weber, and this is something that Yannis had said, is perhaps Weber respect for self-determination. You read Weber and you don't think you have to agree with Weber to continue reading it. Yes, so you can think, okay, Weber wants him to think on our own. So I can read Weber, read capitalism studies and critics capitalism, and continues reading Weber. Yes, so I think this is so important. Yes, the critical spirit that it's in Weber work and life. I think so. Thank you.
Fantastic, Lucia. And so before I open the floor to Sam for a final word, just to say that if you're interested in these activities and in the network and you want to participate, just visit our website, weberscholars.net, or write us an email at info@weberscholars.net, and we can give you more information if you want to suggest an event, if you want to send us something that a new paper on Weber or engaging with Weber in some way, we will send it out in our newsletter. We can also add you to our newsletter. So just again, Sam, thanks so much for your time and for agreeing to join us. Also to Carl and everyone that's participating. Of course, to Yannis and Lucia for their contributions. So Sam, a final word before we close the session?
Well, no need to thank me, Victor. It's the richness of the book is now flooding back to my rather vague memory. But it seems to me that you could almost say there's three faces of Weber. There's the economy and society, which is so stern and formal, and Stephen Turner's presentation on the network the other month brought home that if you see Weber through Kelsen, you know, this is a very formal academic Weber. And that's why doing the Culture of Anarchy was interesting, because, my God, there's a human being as well, which wasn't apparent up to that point. And then, of course, the other face is the political Weber. And just in response to Carl, I mean, Weber really disliked socialism. I mean, he sees that it's going to, and communism, it's going to be a disaster. I mean, he's totally convinced about that, and let's just keep that statement. You know, it's not a anarchism. I agree with Carl that he wants to use the anarchists to point out just what a human disaster socialism will be. You know, it's an iron cage all of its own. I think he got that one right. Now on charisma, I mean, I think it'd be nice to think about, to be charismatic, you don't need a superego, right? It really doesn't help at all. Whereas Weber had a massive superego. And that perhaps is the conversation that young people wanting to try new directions. And I think Victor's comment was entirely right. You know, Logos was not New Left Review, to put it crudely. Who else could they turn to? So, I mean, charisma comes out of an environment of being ignored, of being suppressed. And I would say a bit uneasy about the Caesarist elements of it. And I think Weber was uneasy about that, because once charisma becomes demagoguery, as it does in Trump, then it's not terribly, what's the word? It becomes something different. Whereas, actually, Tom Kemple and I have been corresponding about Wendy Brown, who also introduces the notion of charisma as a way of reinvigorating the demos. Now, whether you could do that within the university, which certainly needs shaking up, because it's now bureaucratized, routinized in a sort of totally Weberian, choked up way, that you do actually need people to crack the mold. Whether you agree with Wendy Brown or not is another matter, but I just mentioned that. And of course, at the moment, perhaps this is something we could have another session on, Victor, what's happening in terms of, if you were a good Freudian, you would say the overdetermined normativity of academia at the moment. I mean, we know why this is going on, and Tom and I have written an editorial in the present issue of Max Weber Studies. And, you know, it's this conflict, and obviously I'm talking about the Palestine-Israel situation, that this whole debate, I didn't extend it, but that was the whole debate with Kurt Eisner and in Munich University, where Weber was defending the right for academics to say what they want, and when academics should keep their mouths shut. I mean, this is it's a volatile subject, but Weber's position and positions being taken now in the university, I think that might be worth revisiting, and that's coming out of this session today. Anyway, so Victor and Yannis and Lucia, thank you very much for your questions, and Carl, nice to see you, and Tom as well. So a great session, I thought.
Thanks, Sam. I think we should definitely take you up on that suggestion, on something maybe on academic freedom, in dialogue with Weber, and reflecting on the situation today and what's happening, and especially having a German thinker as our interlocutor, considering the situation is in a way even more critical in Germany, I would say, regarding the question of how to position yourself critically towards what's happening in Israel-Palestine now. And so I'd be very glad to do that. Maybe something else on Wendy Brown's book. We'd love to do that too, but that's another conversation. The next session will be, I guess, the direct